What is going on, guys? Welcome back. Commentator for you, Jimmy Smith, Ryan Moody, our MMA show. We're here to talk about a card that many of you, including myself, are going to sleep through a little bit of. UFC Fight Night, Edgar versus the Korean Zombie. I understand, and I love the allure of these international cards, but boy, do they really put it on us from a time crunch. And, a lot of these early matchups are really heavy on what I like to call prove it fights. Can you prove that you're going to be a contender and take down a competitor that's from out of your country that maybe has a little bit of a name? We've seen this a lot with the Mexico card most recently, now the Korean cards that we've seen. Jimmy, as the UFC tries to expand globally, are you okay with some of these, setup fights, if you will, more particularly than we see in traditional matchmaking?
Yeah. Penny totally
I guess we agree.
Yes. Look, here's the deal to me. I don't think it's a bad thing when you see a 2-1 UFC fighter taking on the local talent who might be undefeated on the regional scene. Okay, Mike Rodriguez, for example, we'll get into that fight in a minute. 2-1 in his UFC career, Dana White Tuesday Night Contender Series kind of guy, taking on Jung, who is 12-2, hasn't lost since 2016. Is that a setup fight? Or do you want to see how a guy does against someone who has at least cut their teeth in the UFC? Has at least 2 or 3 fights? Can at least say, hey, I've been in the big show and I've gotten a win. Let's see if you can follow in those footsteps. I don't have a problem with that at all. Korean crowd loves it. And it gives us a sense as fans of whether or not this person can not just win, but impress. That's important.
Yeah, and I mean, we get it over here in the U.S. a lot more frequently. It's just not as noticeable when you go and you see, matchups that have, someone from that home card against somebody from another country. We'll start off this with names that I'm going to botch all the way, by the way. Kyung Ho Kang, as we're going to get demonetized, and then Luang Pingyang. I think this is a matchup of strikers, obviously. I feel like Kong is the better of the two, more durable track record as well. And we alluded to the time here. I think the time is going to factor into a couple of these. Not all of them, but a few of them. And I think the home crowd, at least from the Korean side, is going to benefit some of these fighters. I think this matchup being the first of them.
And also, another thing to keep in mind, Chinese versus Korean, a little bit of ethnic rivalry there. Let's put it that way, to kick things off. I think that's very, very interesting. The thing about Liu here is, 19 pro fights. He's comparatively experienced, but fought in the UFC 3 times, hasn't fought any names, and coming off a knockout loss. And when you look at things like that, you want the Korean crowd to get into it. You want them to be raucous. You want them to be screaming and yelling for their guy right from the beginning. And the matchmakers know that. So you kind of look for those matchups that, okay, I see what they're trying to do in terms of priming up the crowd. I think this is one of those.
Going forward, we've got Park versus Barrial. To me, Park is a great boxer, tough fighter, losses to some veterans in the back. I think this is actually really one of the first ones where we see a really good matchup for him. I think the difference here is going to be the pacing. I think Barrial has the better pressure. I think he has the better cardio. I think he can actually weather the bigger hits. And even though on paper it is set up for Park to win, I actually think this is going to be an upset fight. I am going to pick Barrial to win this one.
I picked Barrial to win as well, and my reasoning was Park has kind of stayed in that nether region between 70 and 80 for a lot of his career. I don't think he's a natural middleweight. I think he has trouble with just the physical size and the bullying pressure of Barrial, who is very heavy-handed. Not the most technical guy in the world, but is heavy-handed. I think natural size-wise, he has trouble in this fight.
The next fight is going to be something that we just have to talk about. And I know people don't like politics. Me and Jimmy are not politicians, but the fact of the matter is the Korean fighters do have to take layoffs to serve military. Whether you're for or against that is really irrelevant because it's what happens. We saw this happen with the Korean Zombie before. Now we're seeing it here as well. I went back and I looked and I saw, how did Korean Zombie do after that layoff? He actually came back, beat Dennis Bermudos, had the loss to Rodriguez, and then obviously closed it out with a win. I don't think that it's that big of a deal. I think that they actually still have a very good conditioning base, a very good mental standpoint. I don't think it's a layoff like other layoffs that we could kind of say creates a problem. So when we talk about the fight here between Rodriguez and Jung. To me, Rodriguez is so inconsistent. You know, he looked great against Adam Milstead. I really thought he should have beat Devin Clark. He's got a reach advantage here, but I cannot trust him with this travel. And this, again, like we've alluded to, it's a prove-it fight for Jung. And I think that's what's going to come out of this. I can't trust Mike Rodriguez to win this fight, and that's going to be the end of it. I mean, I really think going forward, when I look at fighters like this, and you look at situations where they've had everything go right for them and they still haven't, lived up to their billing, it's really hard for me to look at them go into enemy territory and live up to the billing. He has to show me something to get back on the right side of this.
Right. I mean, this is the example I talked about in the beginning of a veteran with some UFC experience taking on a talented up-and-comer, good fight win streak. Last time it was in the UFC, guillotine win in round 3. So, this is is your talent up to the numbers kind of fight. And I think in this case, Da-Yoon Jung does have the talent to back up the numbers. And you nailed it right on the head with the inconsistency of Rodriguez. He's had his opportunities against subpar names. I mean, nobody outstanding, no one of note so far on his record, and has yet to separate himself from the pack. I think Da-Yoon Jung certainly on the upside for this one.
Dooho Choi versus Charles Jourdain. I think Jourdain's a very, very well-rounded fighter. I like his explosiveness. I love his spinning attacks, his knees. Choi, like we talked about, the military service, kind of up and down after that. I think Choi's conditioning and his power is going to be an issue here, and I'm actually going to go with Jourdain. I just think he can bring a little bit more. I know the home crowd is always tough in these, and I know, obviously, that the time is going to be a big thing, and I'm going against a lot of the Korean fighters, but I really feel like Charles Jourdain has the opportunity to pull an upset here, just with a little bit more diversified attack.
Yeah, see, that's the X factor here. Is Korean Zombie had a lot of time off, came back, looked fantastic. Number one, he's kind of a freak, and he had a lot of UFC success before his time off. I believe mentally he believed he belonged there. He knows he belongs amongst the elite in his weight class. Choi, 2 losses: Cub Swanson, Jeremy Stevens. Okay, of course, a win over a faded Thiago Tavares. So he's had success in the UFC, 3 wins before those 2 losses. But the step up in name, he realized he's not on that level right now. That was 2 years ago. You have 2 years to think about that loss, to think about the lessons, think about, God, do I really belong here? Is this really where I'm going to find success? All these things. I think that weighs on him a little bit more than Jourdain. Jourdain, I mean, lost to Desmond Green. Desmond Green, extremely athletic, unorthodox, great gas tank. It's easy to lose a decision to a guy like that. I think Choi has a lot more questions coming into this fight. I'd go with Jourdain as well.
Big fight, actually, to me. Big fight in the light heavyweight division. Volkan Oezdemir, who just can't fight in the U.S., believe it or not, against Alexander Rakić. To me, Rakić 4 in a row. UFC wins here, by the way. More than 4 in a row, but 4 in a row in the UFC is pretty impressive. Throws big power, huge leg kicks. I feel like this is going to be his coming out party. I mean, it's not a guy that gets hyped a lot. I think he is a victim of the Jimmy Manawa knockout, where people will look back and say, well, that was just Jimmy Manawa. He's got very solid takedown, although interestingly enough, he doesn't use it for submissions, where we've seen Volkan be a little bit, I guess, weak in the submission game. I think he understands distance control, and I think Volkan really, one of the things he doesn't get a lot of credit for is how he can attack from distance, even when backing up. But I do think, and we've talked about Volkan in the past, I feel like it's just a mounting attack. I know he's went through some personal things. I know he's went through the issues where he can't get into the U.S. And I feel like every fight that he goes into, he has this just a little bit more pressure on him, because he knows he's 1 foot out the door anyway, based on all the problems he has and kind of being relegated to international cards. When you go against a guy like Rakić, who's seen all this stuff, right? He's seen, the John Jones lotto, if you will, play out. And his name is not getting brought up a lot. I feel like he knows this is an opportunity against a guy that is beatable. He has to go out, seize this moment on a co-main event. And I really feel like he's going to take complete advantage of this and put himself in contention to maybe not fight for a title, but at least have his name in the title mix of contenders.
Look at the murderer's row for Volkan Oezdemir: Daniel Cormier, Anthony Smith, Dominic Reyes, Ilir Latifi. 2 of those guys, his losses since DC, both got title fights. Anthony Smith had his, came up short. Dominic Reyes is coming up. One of the biases of the UFC, and I don't necessarily mean this as a negative, just one of the things they see it as, if you're not a major needle mover, if you don't sell scads of pay-per-views, if you don't put asses in seats, you get a title shot. You come up short, especially in dominant fashion, you're out. You're yesterday's news. You become a stepping stone for everybody else. Not necessarily a gatekeeper of the division, because he's still, a dangerous fighter, but a gatekeeper of the elite level. That's Volkan Ozdemir right now. If you can beat Volkan Ozdemir, you're elite. If you're not, if you can't, you're not. Ilir Latifi, good fighter. He's not elite. Dominic Reyes, Anthony Smith, they're elite. So, in that vein, you see what the setup is here. Okay, Rakić, you want to be the next guy? You want to be in line for John Jones, which is kind of like a date with a wood chipper? Get past Volkan Ozdemir. And so I think in a sense, Volkan Ozdemir is taking on a younger, hungrier, physical version of himself in that regard. They're not stylistically that similar, but he's in the place Volkan Ozdemir was a couple years ago looking for that title shot. Devastating puncher. Both these guys have great finishing ability, but I think Rakić just has a little bit more. He's in his prime. He's in the right place at the right time.
Main event, Korean Zombie, originally scheduled to be Brian Ortega. Massive props to Frankie Edgar for stepping up to take this. I think we all know what the Korean Zombie brings to the table. Moves forward, not really much of a threat in being taken down in that moving forward. I think that's going to be critical in this fight. He's got great left hook, great kick, really mixes his shots well to wear down a fighter, especially with the body. I think what's going to be interesting to me is the fact that Edgar should be just a little bit slower than what Zombie is used to seeing at this level, but he's great with takedowns, and he's great with different looks. And he's really good with making counter punchers have problems because he always gives you a different target moving in and out. And that's why this becomes such a tough call for me. I want to go with Korean Zombie because it is, all those things we talked about that really lead him to winning this fight. But at the same time, I don't think Frank Edgar's done by any stretch of the imagination. And I think he knows if he can get a decision win here, and I think that's what it's going to come down to. If he can get a decision win, this is going to put his name right back up where it needs to be among the elite of the division, especially being a short notice. And I just think some of his really strong points working well against what the Korean Zombie does good as well. So it's really going to be interesting to see how Korean Zombie can move forward, deal with really not being given a whole lot of opportunities to counterpunch. And then if Frank Edgar decides to start working takedowns and we see that be successful when we really haven't in the past, I think there's a lot of things that can really push this fight Frank Edgar's way.
This is such a tough one for me. It really is. And I'll lay it all out for you. Very strange choice of fights for Frankie Edgar. We've seen his ceiling at 145 pounds, right? 2 opportunities against Jose Aldo, 1 against Max Holloway, lost all 3 times decisively. So he's going back down to 35. Then he gets this opportunity to take kind of a last-minute fight at 145 against a very dangerous guy, big for the weight class, a pressure style like his, certainly a finisher, a guy who's very hard to finish. He's going to go 25 hard minutes. And for what? And what I mean by that is Frankie Edgar is going down to 135 anyway. What does a win over the Korean Zombie do for him? Doesn't get him back in title contention at 45. He's been down that road. He's not quite there. It would take another, 3 or 4 good fights to get him in there. And then the other side of the coin is he wanted to go down to 35. So a win doesn't set him up for a title shot at 35. It's good. It's a feather in his cap for sure, but 35 is kind of a new slate. He'd have to beat another bantamweight either way. And this fight is just one more fight on the way down there. So you have a very tough fight in front of you, but not a whole lot of reward. Meaning, if he wins, it doesn't give him a title fight at 45. Doesn't do much for him at 35, which is where he wants to go. Against a very tough guy, late notice, with a great gas tank. And Frankie Edgar he has to go back up to 45. So I'm sure there's some dietary changes to kind of bulk back up to 45. He's getting ready for 35. It's a strange choice. And he isn't the kind of guy to phone it in, kind of mentally just not show up at a particular time for a particular fight. But there are a lot of X factors here. And with his style, going 5 rounds over and over and over, every camp and every fight, he just puts in a lot of time. Eventually that catches up with you. Will it catch up to him against a naturally bigger pressure style fighter with real power? Those are all the question marks I have for Frankie Edgar.
Do you think this would have been a tougher fight if it was Brian Ortega? I honestly believe it would have been. So do you feel like this is a step down in competition for the Korean Zombie?
Yeah, I mean, and also I think a win over Ortega does more for him. Unless he blows Frankie Edgar out of the water in the first round, which is very, very tough to do, what are people going to say? Yeah, he beat up a blown up bantamweight. Tough guy, obviously. Frankie Edgar still gets a ton of respect, but Brian Ortega was right there. I mean, obviously he got beat up by Max Holloway, but I think a win over Brian Ortega does more for the Korean Zombie in the division. I don't think he gets the respect beating Frankie Edgar, once again, unless he totally dominates him, that he'd have gotten out of defeating a Brian Ortega.
One final point with this. This card is sandwiched in between what was the biggest fight we'd seen this year, I think, in the UFC 245 card, 3 championship belts in line, of course, and goes in front of UFC 246, McGregor, versus Cowboy, obviously. Do you feel like this is bad posturing by the UFC to put their pretty much year closing card at a 5 a.m. time slot on the East Coast where you're not going to get a lot of eyes? And I know it's strange to say it's the last time to build your card for 2020 when everyone knows, what this card is going to bring. But does it not just seem a little weird to close it out the way that they have?
It is a little strange just because you usually get that year-end card. You usually get, the big end of the year show, kind of, New Year's Eve type stuff. And we're not seeing that. It kind of ends a little bit more with a whimper. It could be the timing of the Conor fight. They don't want a big pay-per-view a couple weeks before Conor Cowboy, which is going to be huge, of course. I think timing-wise, maybe it just didn't work out because, just the timing isn't great for this card. The names aren't fantastic. It's not going to generate huge numbers, but not everyone can be out of the park. We got a great one last week. We're probably going to get a great one with Cowboy versus a Conor. So this is just that dead period happens to be at the end of the year.
It's just weird to see so much. I mean, there's literally going to be more than a month between 246 and 245, and this is going to be the only card in between them. It just seems like that's normally, like you said, not how they've lived up to the billing, so to speak.
Yeah, it's very true. And you never know until you see the card and what kind of fight you're going to get out of it. But yeah, it's one of those things where there's name value all around. There's always going to be those kind of dead zones. And this just happens to be one of those.
Well, we appreciate you guys checking this out. We are going to stick to the full breakdowns. I read enough of the questions about why we were doing them individually. So I think we've learned our lesson about doing one big clump of a show, if you will. We appreciate you guys checking this out, and we'll be back very shortly with more commentary.